Hello and welcome to another episode of Casting Views, the podcast that takes a topic each week and, as the name suggests, cast views. This week I'm diving into a historical subject, and it's something that has been of interest to me for a while since I initially learned about it. And last year I was then able to visit a couple of shows and events in London that featured this subject. And I mean, as the name of the episode suggests, this is about Operation Mincemeat. So last year, I visited the stage show in London, watched that. And then I think just out of pure chance and timing, there was an exhibition in the Imperial War Museum, London, called Spies, Lies and Deception. Now, that was an absolutely fascinating exhibition, as the name would suggest, all about spies, lies and the art of deception. Now, there's going to be some episodes that come out this year related to that, and I can't wait to work on those. But part of that also had a section devoted to Operation Mincemeat. You may have heard of Operation Mincemeat, and as I mentioned, you may have heard or seen the stage show or even seen the film that's been made. But do you know what it's really about? If you do, hopefully you'll still find this interesting. If you don't, the next half hour or so is going to give an overview of what that event was. Operation Mincemeat was a British deception operation in the Second World War, which was used to disguise the 1943 Allied invasion of Sicily. On the 29th of September 1939, shortly after the start of the Second World War, Rear Admiral John Godfrey, the Director of Naval Intelligence, circulated what was called the Trout Memo. This was a paper that compared the deception of an enemy to fly fishing. The journalist and author Ben McIntyre observes that although the paper was published under Godfrey's name, it bore all the hallmarks of Lieutenant Commander Ian Fleming, who was Godfrey's personal assistant. Now, if that last name rings a bell, well, it's because Ian Fleming was the author of the James Bond novels. The memo contained a number of plans to be considered for use against the Axis powers to lure U-boats and German surface ships towards minefields. Number 28 on the list was an entry titled, "A Suggestion, brackets, not a very nice one." It was an idea to plant misleading papers on a corpse that would be found by the enemy. Now, the deliberate planting of fake documents to be found by enemy was not new. Known as the haversack ruse, it had been practiced by the British and others in the First and Second World Wars. In September 1942, an aircraft flying from Britain to Gibraltar crashed off Cadiz. All aboard were killed, including the Paymaster Lieutenant James Haddon Turner, a courier carrying top-secret documents, and a French agent. Turner's documents included a letter from General Mark Clark, the American Deputy Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, to General Noel Mason MacFarlane. He was the British Governor and Commander-in-Chief of Gibraltar. The papers were to inform him that General Dwight D. Eisenhower would be arriving in Gibraltar on the eve of Operation Torch's target date of the 4th of November. Now, just as a sideline, Operation Torch that I just mentioned was an Allied invasion of French North Africa during the Second World War. It was a compromise operation that met the British objective of securing victory in North Africa, while allowing American armed forces the opportunity to begin their fight against Germany and Italy on a limited scale. Turner's body washed up on the beach near Tarifa and was recovered by the Spanish authorities. When the body was returned to the British, the letter was still on it, and technicians determined that the letter had not been opened. Other Allied intelligence sources established that the notebook carried by the French agent had been copied by the Germans, but they dismissed it as being disinformation. To British planners, this showed that some material that was obtained by the Spanish was being passed to the Germans. A month after the Turner crash, British intelligence officer Charles Cholmondeley puts forward his version of the Trout Memo plan, codenamed Trojan Horse. His plan was as follows. A body is obtained from one of the London hospitals. The lungs are filled with water and documents are disposed in an inside pocket. The body is then dropped by a coastal command aircraft. On being found, the supposition in the enemy's mind may well be that one of our aircraft has either been shot or forced down, and that this is one of their passengers. Cholmondeley was a flight lieutenant in the Royal Air Force who had been seconded to MI5, which is Britain's domestic counterintelligence and security service. He had been appointed as secretary of the 20 Committee, a small inter-service, interdepartmental team in charge of double agents. In November of 1942, the 20 Committee turned down Cholmondeley's plan as being unworkable, but thought there may have been some potential in the idea. As there was a naval connection to the plan, John Masterman, who was the chairman of the committee, assigned Ewan Montague, the naval representative, to work with Cholmondeley to develop the plan further. Montague, a peacetime lawyer and King's Counsel who had volunteered at the outbreak of the war, worked under Godfrey at the Naval Intelligence Division, where he ran the sub-branch which handled counter-espionage work. Godfrey had also appointed Montague to oversee all naval deception involving double agents, and as part of his duties, Montague had been briefed on the need for deception operations to aid the Allied war aims in a forthcoming invasion operation in the Mediterranean. In late 1942, with the Allied success in North Africa, military planners turned their attention to the next target. British considered that an invasion of France from Britain could not take place until 1944, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill wanted to use the Allied forces from North Africa to attack Europe's soft underbelly. There were two possible targets for the Allies to attack. The first option was Sicily. Gaining control of the island would open up the Mediterranean Sea to Allied shipping and allow the invasion of continental Europe through Italy. The second option was to go into Greece and the Balkans, to trap the German forces between the British, American and the Soviets. At the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, Allied planners agreed on the selection of Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky, and decided to undertake the invasion no later than July. There was concern, however, among the Allied planners that Sicily was too obvious a choice. Churchill is reputed to have said, "Everyone but a bloody fool would know that it's Sicily," and that the build-up of resources for the invasion would be detected. Adolf Hitler, meanwhile, was concerned about a Balkan invasion, as the area had been the source of raw materials for the German war industry, including copper, chrome and oil. The Allies knew of Hitler's fear, and they launched Operation Barclay, a deception operation to play upon his concerns and to mislead the Germans into thinking the Balkans were the objective, diverting resources from Sicily. The deception reinforced German strategic thinking about the likely British target. To suggest the Eastern Mediterranean was the target, the Allies set up headquarters in Cairo, Egypt, for a fictional formation, the 12th Army. Military manoeuvres were then conducted in Syria, with numbers inflated by dummy tanks and armoured vehicles to deceive observers. Greek interpreters were recruited, and the Allies stockpiled Greek maps and currency. False communications about troop movements were generated from the 12th Army headquarters, while the Allied command post in Tunis, which was to be the headquarters of the Sicily invasion, reduced radio traffic by using landlines wherever possible. Now, we'll start getting into the main part of what Operation Mincemeat was. So, practicalities had to be to locate a corpse for the plan. Now, Montague approached pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury to determine what kind of body they needed and what factors they would need to take into account to deceive a Spanish pathologist. Spilsbury informed him that those who died in an air crash often did so from shock and not drowning. The lungs would not necessarily be filled with water. He also added that Spaniards, as Roman Catholics, were averse to post-mortems and did not hold them unless the cause of death was of great importance. Spilsbury advised that a person could have suffered one of many different causes of death, which could be misconstrued in an autopsy. Montague later wrote, "If a post-mortem examination was made by someone who had formed a preconceived idea that the death was probably due to drowning, there was little likelihood that the difference between this liquid in his lungs that had started to decompose and seawater would be noticed. This meant that not only would they have a better degree of success than they previously thought, but that there would also be a larger number of corpses potentially available for selection when the time came." When Montague discussed the possibility of obtaining a corpse with Bentley Purchase, who was the coroner for the Northern District of London, he was told that there would be practical and legal difficulties. Now, to quote, he says, "I should think bodies are the only commodities not in short supply at the moment, but even with bodies all over the place, each one has to be accounted for." Purchase promised to look out for a body that was suitable with no relatives who would claim the corpse for burial. On the 28th of January 1943, Purchase contacted Montague with the news he had located a suitable body, probably that of, and I'll apologise now if I don't pronounce this totally correctly, but of Glyndŵr Michael. He was a homeless person who had died from eating rat poison. Purchase informed Montague and Chumley that the small amount of poison in the system would not be identified in a body that was supposed to have been floating in the sea for several days. When Montague commented that the undernourished corpse did not look like a fit field officer, Purchase informed him that he does not have to look like an officer, only a staff officer who is more used to office work. Montague refused to identify the individual and, when describing him, bluntly put it as he was a bit of a ne'er-do-well and the only worthwhile thing that he ever did, he did after his death. Now, Michael's identity, I understand, remained a mystery or remained a secret up until 1996. Now, in 1996, Roger Morgan, an amateur historian from London, uncovered evidence in the Public Record Office that the identity of the corpse was Glyndŵr Michael. Right at the end, we'll come on to that. The next part was to develop the plan and the corpse's new identity. Montague selected the codename Mincemeat for the plan. On the 4th of February 1943, Montague and Chumley filed their plan for the operation with the 20 Committee. It was a reworking of the Trojan Horse plan. The mincemeat operation was to place documents on the corpse and then float it off the coast of Spain, whose nominally neutral government was known to cooperate with German military intelligence. The plan was passed by the committee, who then passed it up the chain of command to the senior Allied strategists. Montague and Chumley were ordered to continue with their preparations for the operation. They began to create a legend, which is a fictitious background and character for the body. The name and rank chosen was Captain William Martin of the Royal Marines. As a Royal Marine, Major Martin came under Admiralty authority, and it would be easy to ensure that all official inquiries and messages about his death would be routed to the Naval Intelligence Division. Additionally, Royal Marines would wear battle dress, which was easily obtainable and came in standard sizes. The rank of acting major made him senior enough to be entrusted with sensitive documents, but not so prominent that anyone would be expected to know him. To reinforce the impression of Martin being a real person, Montague and Chumley provided corroborative details to be carried on the person. Now, this is what was really interesting in the Spies, Lies and Deception exhibition I mentioned. In espionage circles, these details were called pocket litter, and a lot of these were on display there to see. So these included a photograph of an invented fiancée named Pam. The image was actually of an MI5 clerk, Jean Leslie. There were 2 love letters, as was a receipt for a diamond engagement ring from a Bond Street jewellery shop. Additional personal correspondence was included, consisting of a letter from the fictitious Martin's father, described by McIntyre as pompous and pedantic as only an Edwardian father could be. This also included a note from the family solicitor and a message from Lloyd's Bank demanding a payment of an overdraft. So all this was to kind of give him a background to make it look like he was in the middle of a lot of life situations. To ensure the letters would remain legible after immersion in seawater, Montague asked MI5 scientists to conduct tests on different inks to see which would last longest in the water. Other items of pocket litter placed on Martin included a book of stamps, a silver cross and a St. Christopher's medallion, cigarettes, matches, a pencil stub, keys and a receipt for a new shirt. To provide a date that Martin had been in London, ticket stubs from a London theatre and a bill for 4 nights lodging at the Naval Military Club were added. Along with the other items placed on him, an itinerary of his activity in London could be traced from the 18th to the 24th of April. Attempts were made to photograph the corpse for the naval identity card Martin would have to carry, but the results were unsatisfactory, and it was obvious that the images were of a cadaver. Montague and Chumley conducted a search for people who resembled the corpse, ultimately finding Captain Ronnie Reed of MI5. Reed agreed to be photographed for the card wearing a Royal Marine uniform. As the 3 cards and passes needed to look not too new as Martin was a long-serving officer, they were issued as recent replacements for the lost originals. Montague then spent the next few weeks rubbing all 3 cards on his trousers to provide a used sheen to them. To provide a used look to the uniform, it was worn by Chumley, who was about the same build. The only non-issue part to the uniform was the underwear, which was in short supply in war ration Britain, so a pair of good quality woolen underwear was used. Montague then outlined 3 criteria for the document that contained the details of the falsified plans to land in the Balkans. He said that the target should be casually but clearly identified, that it should name Sicily and another location as cover, and that it should be in an unofficial correspondence that would not normally be sent by diplomatic courier or encoded signal. The main document being proposed was a personal letter from Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye, who was the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, who had a deep knowledge of ongoing military operations, to General Sir Harold Alexander, commander of the Anglo-American 18th Army Group. After several attempts at drafting, the document did not generate something that was considered natural. It was suggested that Nye should draw up the letter himself to cover the required points. The letter covers several reportedly sensitive subjects, such as the unwanted award of Purple Heart medals by US forces to British servicemen serving with them, and the appointment of a new commander of the Brigade of Guards. Montague thought the result was quite brilliant. The key part of the letter stated that we have recent information that the Germans have been reinforcing and strengthening their defences in Greece and Crete. Chief of the Imperial General Staff felt that our forces for the assault were insufficient. It was agreed by the Chiefs of Staff that the 5th Division should be reinforced by 1 brigade group for the assault on the beach south of Cape Araxos, and that a similar reinforcement should be made for the 56th Division at Kalamata. The letter went on to identify Sicily and the Dodecanese as cover targets for the assaults, along with justifications for their selection. There was also a letter of introduction for Martin from his commanding officer, Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, to Admiral of the Fleet Sir Andrew Cunningham. Martin was referred to in the letter as an amphibious warfare expert on loan until the assault is over. The document included a clumsy joke about sardines, which Montague inserted in the hope that the Germans would see it as a reference to a planned invasion of Sardinia. A single black eyelash was placed within the letter to check if the Germans or Spanish had opened it. Montague considered that there might be a possible Roman Catholic prejudice against tampering with corpses. This could therefore mean that officers might miss the documents stored in Michael's pockets, so they also added them to an official briefcase that would not be overlooked. To justify carrying documents in a briefcase, Major Martin was given 2 proof copies of the official pamphlet on combined operations written by the author Hilary Saunders, who at this time was on Mountbatten's staff, and a letter from Mountbatten to Eisenhower asking him to write a brief foreword for the pamphlet's US edition. The planning team first thought of having the handle clutched in Michael's hand, held in place by rigor mortis, but the rigor would probably wear off and the briefcase would have drifted away. They therefore equipped Martin with a leather-covered chain, such as was used by bank and jewellery couriers to secure their cases against snatching. The chain unobtrusively runs down a sleeve to the case, and to Montague it seemed unlikely that the Major would keep the bag secured to his wrist during the long flight from Britain, so the chain was looped around the belt of a trench coat. Montague and Chumley had to carefully plan the location of Martin's delivery. It had long been assumed by the pair that the western coast of Spain would be the ideal location. Earlier in the planning, they investigated the possibility of Portuguese and French coasts, but rejected those in favour of Huelva on the coast of southern Spain, after advice was taken regarding the tides and currents best suited to ensure the body landed where it was intended. Montague later outlined that the choice of Huelva was also made because, and to quote him, there was a very active German agent who had excellent contacts with certain Spaniards, both officials and others. Now, the agent Adolf Klaus, a member of the German Military Intelligence Service, was the son of the German consul and operated under the cover of an agriculture technician. Huelva was also chosen because the British vice consul in the city, Francis Haselden, was, and I quote, a reliable and helpful man, who could be relied upon, according to Montague. Martin's body was supposed to be the victim of an aeroplane crash, and it was decided that trying to simulate the accident at sea using flares and other devices would be too risky and open to discovery. After seaplanes and surface ships were dismissed as being problematic, a submarine was chosen as the method of delivering the corpse to the region. To transport the body by submarine, it needed to be contained within the body of the boat, as any externally mounted container would have to be built with a skin so thick it would alter the level of the waterline. The canister needed to remain airtight and keep the body as fresh as possible through its journey. Spilsbury provided the medical requirements, and Cholmondeley contacted Charles Fraser Smith of the Ministry of Supply to produce a container, which was labelled "Handle with Care Optical Instruments." On the 13th of April 1943, the Committee of the Chiefs of Staff met and agreed that they thought the plan should go ahead. The committee informed Colonel John Bevan, the head of London Controlling Section, which controlled the planning and coordination of deception operations, that he needed to obtain final approval from Churchill. 2 days later, Bevan met the Prime Minister, who was said to be in bed, wearing a dressing gown and smoking a cigar, in his rooms at the Cabinet War Offices, and explained the plan. He warned Churchill that there were several aspects that could go wrong, including that the Spaniards might pass the corpse back to the British with the papers unread. Churchill replied, "In that case, we shall have to get the body back and give it another swim." Churchill gave his approval to the operation, but delegated the final confirmation to Eisenhower, the overall military commander in the Mediterranean, whose plan to invade Sicily would be affected. Bevan sent an encrypted telegram to Eisenhower's headquarters in Algeria requesting final confirmation, which was received on the 17th of April. So now we move on to the execution of Operation Mincemeat. In the early hours of 17th of April 1943, the corpse of Michael was dressed as Martin, although there was one last-minute hitch. The feet had frozen. Purchase, Montague and Cholmondeley could not put the boots on, so an electric heater was located and the feet defrosted enough to put the boots on properly. The pocket litter was placed on the body and briefcase attached. The body placed in a canister which was filled with 21 pounds of dry ice and sealed up. When the dry ice turned into its gaseous form, it filled the canister with carbon dioxide and drove out any oxygen, thus preserving the body without the need for refrigeration. The canister was placed in a 1937 Fordson van of an MI5 driver, St. John Jock Horsfall, who had been a racing champion before the war. Cholmondeley and Montague travelled in the back of the van, which drove through the night to Greenock in West Scotland, where the canister was taken on board the submarine HMS Seraph, which was preparing for deployment to the Mediterranean. Seraph's commander, Lieutenant Bill Jewell, and crew had previous special operations experience. Jewell told his men that the canister contained a top-secret meteorological device to be deployed near Spain. On the 19th of April, Seraph set sail and arrived just off the coast of Huelva on the 29th of April after being bombed twice en route. After spending the day observing the coastline, at 4:15 a.m. on the 30th of April, Seraph surfaced. Jewell had the canister brought up on deck, then sent all his crew below except the officers. They opened the container and lowered the body into the water. Jewell read Psalm 39 and ordered the engines to full astern. The wash from the propellers pushed the body towards the shore. The canister was reloaded and the submarine travelled 12 miles out of where it surfaced, and the empty container was pushed into the water. As it floated, it was riddled with machine gun fire so it would sink. Because of the air trapped in the insulation, this effort failed and the canister was destroyed with plastic explosives. Jewell afterwards sent a message to the Admiralty to say "mincemeat completed" and continued on to Gibraltar. The body of Major Martin was found at around 9:30 a.m. on the 30th of April by a local fisherman. It was taken to Huelva by Spanish soldiers, where it was handed over to a naval judge. Haselden, as vice-consul, was officially informed by the Spaniards. He reported back to the Admiralty that the body and briefcase had been found. A series of pre-scripted diplomatic cables were sent between Haselden and his superiors, which continued for several days. The British knew that these were being intercepted, and although they were encrypted, the Germans had broken the code. The messages played out the story that it was imperative that Haselden retrieve the briefcase because it was important. At midday on the 1st of May, an autopsy was undertaken on Michael's body. Haselden was present, and in order to minimise the possibilities that the two Spanish doctors would discover the body was a 3-month-old corpse, asked if, in the heat of the day and the smell of the corpse, the doctor should bring the post-mortem to a close and have lunch. They agreed and signed a death certificate for Major William Martin for asphyxiation through immersion in the sea. The body was released by the Spanish, and as Major Martin was buried in the San Marcos section of Nuestra Senora Cemetery in Huelva with full military honours on the 2nd of May. So what about the briefcase? The Spanish Navy retained the briefcase, and despite pressure from Adolf Klaus and some of his intelligence agents, neither it nor its contents were handed over to the Germans. On the 5th of May, the briefcase was passed to the naval headquarters at San Fernando near Cadiz for forwarding to Madrid. While at San Fernando, the contents were photographed by German sympathisers, but the letters were not opened. Once the briefcase arrived in Madrid, its contents became the focus of attention of Karl Erich Kuhlenthal, one of the most senior intelligence agents in Spain. He asked Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of the German military intelligence service, to personally intervene and persuade the Spanish to surrender the documents. Acceding to the request, the Spanish removed the still damp paper by tightly winding it around a probe into a cylindrical shape and then pulling it out between the envelope flap, which was still closed by a wax seal, and the envelope body. The letters were dried and photographed, then soaked in salt water for 24 hours before being reinserted into their envelopes without the eyelash that had been planted there. The information was passed to the Germans on the 8th of May. This was deemed so important by agents in Spain that Kuhlenthal personally took the documents himself to Germany. On the 11th of May, the briefcase complete with documents was returned to Haselden by the Spanish authorities, which he forwarded on to London. On receipt, the documents were forensically examined and the absence of the eyelash was noted. Further tests showed that the fibres in the paper had been damaged by folding more than once, which confirmed the letters had been extracted and read. An additional test was made as the papers, which were still wet by the time they returned to London, were dried out. The folded paper dried into the rolled form it had when the Spaniards had extracted it from the envelope. To allay any potential German fears that their activities had been discovered, another pre-arranged, encrypted but breakable cable was sent to Haselden stating that the envelopes had been examined but they had not been opened. Haselden leaked the news to the Spaniards known to be sympathetic to the Germans. Final proof that the Germans had been passed the information from the letters came on the 14th of May when a German communication was decrypted by the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park. Now, Bletchley Park actually was another place I visited last year, and again, just tells a fascinating history of the code breaking and the efforts made during wars. But again, I'll come to that in another episode. The message, which had been sent 2 days previously, warned that the invasion was to be in the Balkans with a nod to the Dodecanese. A message was sent by Brigadier Leslie Hollis, the secretary to the Chief Staff Committee, to Churchill, who was then in the United States. It read, "Mincemeat swallowed rod, line and sinker by the right people, and from the best information they look like acting on it." Montague continued the deception to reinforce the existence of Major Martin and included his details in a published list of British casualties which appeared in the Times on the 4th of June. By coincidence, also published that day were the names of 2 other officers who had died when their plane was lost at sea. And opposite the casualty listings was a report that the film star Leslie Howard had been shot down and died in the Bay of Biscay. Both stories gave credence to the Major Martin story. So what was the German reaction to the letters? Well, on the 14th of May 1943, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz met Hitler to discuss his recent visit to Italy, his meeting with the Italian leader Benito Mussolini, and the progress of the war. The Admiral, referring to the Mincemeat documents as the Anglo-Saxon order, recorded, "The Fuhrer does not agree with Mussolini that the most likely invasion point is Sicily. Furthermore, he believes that the discovered Anglo-Saxon order confirms the assumption that the planned attacks will be directed mainly against Sardinia and the Peloponnesus." Hitler informed Mussolini that Greece, Sardinia and Corsica must be defended at all costs, and that German troops would be best placed to do the job. He ordered that the experienced 1st Panzer Division be transferred from France to Salonika, Greece. The order was intercepted by Bletchley Park on the 21st of May. By the end of June, German troop strength on Sardinia had been doubled to 10,000, with fighter aircraft also based there as support. German torpedo boats were moved from Sicily to the Greek islands in preparation. 7 German divisions transferred to Greece, raising the number present to 8, and 10 were posted to the Balkans, raising the number present to 18. On the 9th of July, the Allies invaded Sicily in Operation Husky. German signals intercepted by Bletchley Park showed that even 4 hours after the invasion of Sicily had begun, 21 aircraft left Sicily to reinforce Sardinia. For a considerable time after the initial invasion, Hitler was still convinced that an attack on the Balkans was imminent, and in late July he sent General Erwin Rommel to Salonika to prepare the defence of the region. By the time the German High Command realised the mistake, it was too late to make a difference. So, what was the result of this plan? On the 25th of July 1943, as the battle for Sicily went against the Axis forces, the Italian Grand Council of Fascism voted to limit the power of Mussolini and handed control of the Italian armed forces over to King Victor Emmanuel III. The following day, Mussolini met the king, who dismissed him as prime minister. The former dictator was then imprisoned. A new Italian government took power and began secret negotiations with the Allies. Sicily fell on the 17th of August after a force of 65,000 Germans held off 400,000 American and British troops long enough to allow many of the Germans to evacuate to the Italian mainland. Military historian John Latimer observes that the relative ease with which the Allies captured Sicily was not entirely because of mincemeat or the wider deception of Operation Barclay. Latimer identifies other factors, including Hitler's distrust of the Italians and his unwillingness to risk German troops alongside Italians who may have been on the point of a general surrender. Another military historian, Michael Howard, while describing mincemeat as perhaps the most successful single deception operation of the entire war, considered mincemeat and Barclay to have had less impact on the course of the Sicily campaign than Hitler's obsession with the Balkans. McIntyre writes that the exact impact of mincemeat is impossible to calculate. Although the British had expected 10,000 killed or wounded in the first week of fighting, only a seventh of that number became casualties. The Navy expected 300 ships would be sunk in the action, but they lost 12, and the predicted 90-day campaign was over in 38. It was also stated that as a result of Operation Husky, Hitler suspended the Kursk offensive on the 13th of July. This was partly because of the performance of the Soviet army, but also because he still assumed that the Allied landing on Sicily was a feint that preceded the invasion in the Balkans, and he wanted to have troops available for fast deployment to meet them. It was observed that once Hitler gave up the initiative to the Soviets, he never regained it. So what's the legacy of all this? Montagu was appointed an officer of the Order of the British Empire in 1944 for his part in Operation Mincemeat. Cholmondeley was appointed a member of the Order in 1948. Duff Cooper, a former cabinet minister who had been briefed on the operation in March 1943, published the spy novel Operation Heartbreak in 1950, which contained the plot device of a corpse with papers naming him as William Merrington being floated off the coast of Spain with false documents to deceive the Germans. British security services decided that the best response was to publish a story of mincemeat. Over the course of a weekend, Montagu wrote The Man Who Never Was in 1953. This sold 2 million copies and formed the basis for a film in 1956. Security services did not give Montagu complete freedom to reveal operational details. He was careful not to mention the role played by the signals intelligence to confirm that the operation had been successful. He was also careful to obscure the idea of an organised programme of strategic deception, with mincemeat being presented as a wild one-off caper. In 1977, Montagu published Beyond Top Secret U, his wartime autobiography, which gave further details of mincemeat among other operations. In 2010, journalist Ben McIntyre published Operation Mincemeat, A History of the Events, and the play Operation Mincemeat, written by Adrian Jackson and Farhana Sheikh, was first staged by the Cardboard Citizens Theatre Company in 2001, and the work focused on Michael's homelessness. In 2014, a musical called Dead in the Water performed at Camden, Brighton and Guildford Fringe Festivals. In 2015, the Welsh Theatre staged The Man Who Never Was, a musical based on the operation and Glinda Michael's upbringing in Aberbargoed. The musical was performed by primary school children from Caerphilly County Borough. And the final three things just to mention around this. So in 2014, there was a BBC television series called Fleming, the Man Who Would Be Bond, which dramatised some aspects of Operation Mincemeat and Fleming's connection to the operation. In 2019, Operation Mincemeat, the musical, began, which is the one I mentioned at the start. So this is now, I believe, still at the Fortune Theatre in London. And in 2022, Operation Mincemeat film was released with Colin Firth as Montague and Matthew McFadden as Chumley. So I think the final comments on this has to be with Glinda Michael. Now, I've mentioned the musical a couple of times, and I just want to say that they do, especially at the end, it's actually quite a moving tribute they pay to Glinda Michael at the end. You've probably heard in the description above or the recollection of this story, some quite blunt descriptions by the people at the time of the body and the actions they were performing. It's important to say that the part that he had and the fact he was, I think I mentioned he was buried with full military honour when Michael was first buried. I think the plaque did have The Man Who Never Was, or it was unnamed. But then when the name came to light in 1996, the name was added to the plaque. He's still buried in Huelva, Spain. The body still stays there. I hope you found this as interesting as I did when learning about it. It's just something that had an impact on me when I saw both the show and the exhibition. I'll leave it there. As I mentioned, I think you'll hear over the course of the year some more episodes kind of related to similar things. But yeah, drop me a line on social media if you have any comments on this. Otherwise, I'll see you next week for another episode of Casting Views.
2, 3, 4. If I want your opinion, I will give it to you. Come on, check what we've got, 'cause you need it. Don't make us get